In a pristine California suburb ruled by a ruthless HOA, one man dares to defy their tyranny with solar panels. But when the power-hungry president fights back, she has no idea he controls the real power. Alex Green had always been a man of vision. A skilled electrical engineer and entrepreneur, he had spent years working on renewable energy projects, designing efficient solar power solutions, and advocating for clean energy independence. When the opportunity arose to purchase a beautiful, modern home in an upscale California neighborhood, he saw it as more than just a place to live. It was the perfect proving ground for his ideals. Unlike the cookie-cutter mansions that lined the streets, his house was a testament to self-sufficiency. Equipped with state-of-the-art solar panels covering its roof and Tesla Powerwall batteries storing excess energy, his home operated completely off the grid. From the moment Alex moved in, his presence did not go unnoticed. His new neighborhood was managed by an aggressively strict homeowners association, HOA, a body notorious for its obsessive enforcement of aesthetic and property rules. And at the helm of it all was Karen Blake, the HOA president, a middle-aged woman with an iron grip on the community, a penchant for unsolicited authority, and an intolerance for anything she deemed disruptive. For the first few weeks, Alex kept to himself, busy finalizing his home's energy system and settling into his new life. But soon, whispers started circulating. Neighbors gossiped about his unusual setup, questioning why his home lacked traditional power lines, connecting it to the municipal grid. A few residents even approached him, some out of curiosity, others with poorly concealed skepticism. Then came the first official warning letter from the HOA, slipped into his mailbox with bureaucratic precision. The document, written in the usual legalese, stated that his solar panels were aesthetic violations and that their unconventional appearance disrupted the visual harmony of the community. The HOA demanded that he remove them within 10 days or face daily fines. There was no room for discussion, no consideration for the environmental benefits, and certainly no acknowledgement of California's state laws that protected homeowners' rights to install solar panels. Alex read the letter twice, then chuckled. It was almost amusing. Almost. He had expected some level of resistance from an HOA, but this was absurd. He knew his rights. California law was clear. Homeowners associations could not prohibit solar panels under state legislation promoting renewable energy. His system was fully permitted, legally compliant, and far more efficient than the outdated grid his neighbors relied upon. Instead of reacting with frustration, Alex decided to play along, at least for now. He drafted a polite but firm response, attaching copies of the legal statutes protecting his solar installation. Dear HOA, President, I appreciate your concern regarding the aesthetics of my property. However, per California Civil Code Section 714, my solar energy system is fully compliant with state laws and is not subject to removal. I'm always happy to discuss the benefits of solar power should the HOA be interested in learning more about sustainable energy solutions. Satisfied, he dropped the letter off at the HOA office. He knew this was just the beginning. Later that evening, while enjoying a quiet moment on his patio, he spotted Karen Blake standing at the edge of his property, arms crossed, staring at his roof with visible disdain. Her mouth was pressed into a tight line, her eyes flicking between his panels and her phone as if preparing an attack strategy. Alex smirked. This was going to be interesting. The HOA wasted no time in escalating the conflict. Just 3 days after Alex had submitted his formal response, a second letter appeared in his mailbox, this one far less polite. The language had changed from bureaucratic concern to outright aggression. Failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in escalating fines, it warned. The penalties started at $500 per week, doubling with each additional violation. According to the notice, his solar panels were an unauthorized alteration and a hazard to the neighborhood's visual integrity. The HOA even claimed that his system might be interfering with radio signals and home security systems, a completely baseless accusation, but one designed to stir paranoia among his neighbors. Alex wasn't surprised. He had expected Karen to fight back, and he was ready. He ignored the threats and carried on with his life, continuing to enjoy his fully independent power supply. But Karen wasn't about to let it go. If fines wouldn't pressure him, then social ostracization might. Within days, the neighborhood was buzzing with new rumors. Some neighbors started whispering about how Alex's solar panels were dangerous and might start a fire. Others repeated Karen's ridiculous claim that his setup was interfering with Wi-Fi and satellite TV reception. A few even avoided eye contact when he passed by. It didn't take long for Alex to notice a black SUV with tinted windows parked near his house at odd hours, watching his property. At first, he thought it was just a nosy neighbor. But when he saw someone inside holding a clipboard and taking photos of his roof, he realized what was happening. Karen had hired a private contractor to document violations. But things didn't stop at surveillance. One morning, Alex woke up to find his water supply mysteriously shut off. A quick call to the city confirmed what he already suspected. There were no issues with the main lines, and his address wasn't listed as having scheduled maintenance. Someone had tampered with the local system. Then came the real act of aggression. Late one night, Alex heard a strange noise outside. Checking his security cameras, he saw two figures sneaking onto his property with a ladder. They climbed onto his roof, and one of them smashed a solar panel with a hammer before sprinting away. Furious, Alex immediately called the police, reporting the act of vandalism. When the officers arrived, they took a statement, but made it clear that without clear identification of the vandals, there was little they could do. Alex suspected Karen's involvement, but he had no proof, yet. The next day, he installed additional security cameras covering every angle of his property. He also called his lawyer. If Karen wanted a war, she had just gotten one. Alex had expected Karen to escalate, but even he was unprepared for the audacity of what came next. She had already tried fines, intimidation, and sabotage. When none of it worked, she decided to take matters into her own hands, with an act so bold, so outright illegal, that it would seal her fate. It started early, on a crisp Tuesday morning. Alex had just returned from his usual morning run, sweat still clinging to his skin, when he noticed a group of construction workers standing on his driveway. They were unloading tools and equipment from their orange vests reflecting the morning sun. His gut tightened. Something was wrong. Then he saw her. Karen Blake stood near the curb, clipboard in hand, barking orders like a general on a battlefield. She wore an expression of absolute authority, as if she were personally overseeing an important community project. Alex quickened his pace, cutting across the lawn as the workers positioned a ladder against the side of his house. One man was already climbing onto the roof. "Hey!" Alex's voice boomed across the driveway. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" One of the workers hesitated, but Karen immediately spun on her heel, flashing a smug, self-satisfied smile. "Good morning, Alex," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "We're just taking care of a long-overdue issue. You've ignored multiple violation notices, and the HOA has authorized the removal of your illegal solar panels." Alex's blood ran hot. "You've got to be kidding me. These panels are legally installed, and you have no right—" "Oh, but I do," Karen interrupted, tapping the clipboard. "I have official removal orders right here. Your so-called legal setup was reviewed by our compliance committee, and we found that it violates multiple HOA guidelines. You were warned. You refused to act. So now, we're handling it for you. Alex strode forward, snatching the papers from her hands. His eyes skimmed the document. It looked official. Watermarks, signatures, and a stamped approval. But something was off. These documents aren't real, he growled. This isn't city approved. Where did you get this? Karen shrugged. The HOA has jurisdiction over all properties in this neighborhood. You should have read your agreement more carefully before moving in. Alex took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. His first instinct was to grab his phone and call the police, but then he had an even better idea. Keeping his movements casual, he slid his phone from his pocket and began recording. Well, this is fascinating, Karen, he said, voice suddenly level. Because I'm recording all of this, and once the police see your official documents, I wonder what they'll think when they realize you forged legal paperwork. Karen's smirk wavered, but she quickly recovered. You can record all you want, she snapped. That doesn't change the fact that these panels are being removed today. Alex turned his camera toward the workers. Boys, I suggest you stop right now, because in about 5 minutes, the police are going to be here, and you're going to want to explain why you're trespassing on private property and destroying legally installed infrastructure. The workers exchanged uneasy glances. Ma'am, one of them hesitated, are you sure about this? If this guy owns the house, we could get in serious trouble. Karen whirled on him. Do you work for me, or do you work for him? She snapped. I hired you to do a job. Get back up there and... She didn't get to finish her sentence. The distant wail of police sirens sliced through the morning air. Karen paled. Alex folded his arms, watching with satisfaction as 2 squad cars pulled up in front of his house. Showtime. The arrival of the police shattered the illusion of Karen's authority. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands resting on their belts, surveying the scene with practiced neutrality. The workers, sensing the shift in power, froze mid-action. The man on the roof hesitated, then carefully began his descent, unwilling to be caught in the middle of what was clearly a legal disaster in progress. Karen's face had gone ghostly pale, her confident posture now rigid with barely contained panic. She opened her mouth to speak, likely to weave some excuse, but Alex beat her to it. Officers, I'd like to report trespassing, property destruction, and fraudulent documentation, he said, voice steady but edged with controlled fury. These workers were hired under false pretenses. This woman, he gestured to Karen, forged documents to make it appear as if she had the legal right to remove my solar panels. One of the officers turned to Karen. Ma'am, is this true? Karen forced a tight, shaky smile, the kind a liar wears when they know the truth is catching up to them. This is just a misunderstanding, she stammered. The HOA has authority over all properties in this neighborhood. Mr. Green has been violating community regulations, and as HOA president, it's my job to enforce compliance. The officer raised an eyebrow. Mind if I take a look at those documents? Karen hesitated for one crucial second too long. Alex handed over the papers instead. The officer took his time flipping through the pages, his frown deepening. These aren't legally binding, he said after a moment, looking up at Karen. HOA policies don't override state law, and according to our system, Mr. Green's property was never part of the HOA to begin with. Karen visibly stiffened. Alex could see the exact moment she realized she had made a critical miscalculation. Then a new sound broke the tension. the murmuring voices of the neighbors. People had started gathering near their driveways, watching with wide eyes as the untouchable Karen Blake was being questioned by the police. Some of them looked concerned, others downright furious. "I knew it!" a voice came from the small crowd. It was an older man, his arms crossed. "I've been paying fines for years, and I bet half of them were just Karen, pocketing the money." "I got cited for leaving my garbage cans out an extra hour," a woman huffed. "Meanwhile, she's been doing this." The whispers grew into murmurs, then outright accusations. The community had feared Karen for so long, bending to her rules and arbitrary fines, but now they saw her for what she truly was. Alex turned back to the officer. "I'd like to press formal charges," he said, voice even. He wasn't just doing this for himself, he was doing it for every homeowner Karen had bullied. Karen let out a strangled breath, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. But there was none. Not anymore. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Every seat was filled. Neighbors, HOA board members, reporters eager to witness the fall of the infamous Karen Blake. The air was thick with anticipation, a silent charge running through the spectators. For years, Karen had ruled over the neighborhood like a dictator, issuing fines, imposing arbitrary rules, and silencing dissent. But today, she wasn't in charge. Today, she was the one under scrutiny. Alex sat at the plaintiff's table, composed but alert, his lawyer flipping through neatly organized files. Across from him, Karen sat stiffly, her usual arrogance replaced with something foreign, pure, undiluted fear. She wore a blazer that was a size too big. Her usually sharp bob looked slightly disheveled, and her hands clutched the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, adjusted her glasses as she reviewed the case. "Mrs. Blake," the judge began, her voice steady but heavy with authority, "you are facing serious charges, including forgery, destruction of private property, and trespassing. Do you understand the severity of these accusations?" Karen swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex watched her, unimpressed. The same woman who had strutted onto his property like a queen now looked like a schoolgirl caught cheating on a test. The prosecution wasted no time. They began with the forged HOA documents, blowing up high-resolution copies onto a screen for the jury to see. "These documents," the prosecutor said, pacing slowly, "claim to be legally binding removal orders. However, as forensic analysis shows, the signatures were forged, the city's approval stamp was counterfeit, and the property violation codes cited do not exist in any legal register. Mrs. Blake, did you personally create these documents?" Karen shifted uncomfortably, her lips parting, then closing. She hesitated just long enough to make the answer clear. I believed they were legitimate," she finally said, her voice unconvincing even to herself. The prosecutor pounced. "You believed?" "Mrs. Blake, as president of the HOA, you of all people should be familiar with legitimate legal documents. You expected the defendant to take these at face value. In reality, you orchestrated an elaborate fraud, hoping to intimidate Mr. Green into submission. And when that failed, you went even further, hiring a crew to destroy his legally installed property." Karen visibly flinched. The next piece of evidence was even worse. The security footage. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, turning to the judge, "the defendant's property was equipped with security cameras which captured the entire incident." The video played on the large screen. Alex leaned back in his chair, watching Karen's face drain of all color as the recording showed her standing on his driveway, ordering the workers to proceed. The footage zoomed in on her expression, smug, entitled, completely unconcerned with the legality of her actions. The jury took it all in, their expressions unreadable, but the disgust in the audience was evident. Some neighbors shook their heads, while others whispered angrily among themselves. The most damning evidence came when one of the construction workers took the stand. "We asked her if she was sure about this," he said, glancing briefly at Karen before turning back to the prosecutor. "One of the guys didn't feel right about it, but she just told us, 'I'm in charge here. Do your job and don't ask questions.'" Karen buried her face in her hands. When Alex was called to the stand, he spoke with calm precision, recounting the months of harassment, fines, and finally, the outright destruction of his property. "This wasn't just about me," he said, turning slightly toward the audience, where many of his neighbors sat. Karen abused her power for years. I wasn't her first victim, but I made sure I would be the last. Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. The defense tried a pathetic last-ditch attempt at framing Karen as simply overzealous in her duties, but the evidence was too overwhelming. When the judge finally spoke, her tone was cold, unforgiving. "Mrs. Blake," she said, staring directly at Karen, "your actions were not only unlawful, but deeply unethical. You knowingly falsified legal documents, manipulated your position to intimidate residents, and destroyed private property in a flagrant abuse of power. This court finds you guilty on all charges." Karen's shoulders collapsed inward, her entire body trembling. "I hereby sentence you to 2 years in state prison for forgery and fraud, along with an additional 6 months for property destruction. Furthermore, you will pay $250,000 in damages to Mr. Green and reimburse the residents of your community for the unlawful fines you imposed during your tenure as HOA president." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted wildly, as if looking for someone, anyone, who might save her, but no one did. 2 uniformed officers approached her. Wait, please, Your Honor," she cried, her voice rising to hysteria. "This was all a misunderstanding. I was trying to protect the neighborhood. Her words cut off as the officers pulled her to her feet. Alex sat still, watching as Karen Blake, the untouchable tyrant of the HOA, was led away in handcuffs. Justice had been served. The fallout from Karen's conviction sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. In the days following the trial, a noticeable shift in atmosphere took place, one that Alex could feel every time he stepped outside. The fear that had once gripped the community under Karen's rule had dissipated, replaced by something far less oppressive. People no longer lowered their voices when discussing HOA matters. They no longer checked over their shoulders when leaving their trash cans out for an extra day. The reign of terror was officially over. For the first time since moving in, Alex saw his neighbors not as distant, rule-fearing strangers, but as people finally waking up from years of enforced submission. The very same residents who had once avoided eye contact with him now waved as he passed by, some even stopping to chat. A few brave ones knocked on his door, offering everything from apologies to homemade cookies. "I had no idea how much power she actually had," one older woman admitted, shaking her head in disbelief. "We all hated her rules, but we just assumed we had to follow them. I wish we had spoken up sooner." Another neighbor, a man in his 40s who had been fined for having a garden gnome deemed aesthetic pollution, let out a dry laugh. "We thought she had the law on her side. Turns out she was just making up rules as she went." Alex took it all in with a quiet satisfaction. He hadn't set out to be the neighborhood's hero, but he had undeniably become one. By standing his ground, He had done what no one else had dared to do. He exposed Karen's abuses for what they were, and freed the community from her control. But the changes didn't stop at attitudes. The HOA itself underwent a massive transformation. After Karen's conviction, the remaining HOA board members scrambled to repair the damage she had done. An emergency election was held to fill the now vacant president's seat. And for the first time, the homeowners were given a real voice in the association's decisions. To Alex's surprise, several board members approached him personally. "We need someone strong," one of them said, an eager glint in his eyes. "Someone who isn't afraid to stand up to corruption. We'd like you to run for HOA president." Alex nearly laughed out loud. "Me?" He shook his head. "No, thanks." The board members blinked, confused. "But after everything you did—" "Exactly," Alex interrupted, leaning back with a grin. "I did my part. I just want to enjoy my home without someone telling me what color I can paint my front door." There was a beat of silence. Then, one of the board members chuckled. "Fair enough." Instead, Alex offered his own suggestion. An HOA that focused on actual community improvement, not micromanaging people's lives. The board took his words to heart. Within weeks, ridiculous fines were revoked, residents were refunded money they never should have paid, and a new, much leaner rulebook was introduced, one that actually made sense. A wave of relief swept through the neighborhood. People began decorating their homes freely, planting gardens without fear, even throwing block parties without Karen's oppressive watch. For the first time, Alex felt at home. It had been a month since Karen's sentencing, and life in the neighborhood had never been better. The HOA had been restructured, the ridiculous fines had been revoked, and a newfound sense of freedom had settled over the community. People smiled more, talked more, and most importantly, stopped living in fear of arbitrary rules. Alex had enjoyed watching it all unfold from a distance, content to finally live in peace. His solar panels were back in place, fully restored, shining proudly in the California sun. The HOA had even formally apologized for the ordeal, though Alex hadn't needed it. Karen's downfall had been satisfaction enough. One quiet afternoon, he was lounging on his patio, a cold beer in hand, when he noticed an unfamiliar car slowly pulling up to the curb. It was an older sedan, the kind that had seen better days, and it stopped just outside his house. At first he thought it was a lost delivery driver, but then the driver's side door creaked open, and Karen Blake stepped out. Alex raised an eyebrow, setting down his drink. She looked different. The sharp, confident woman who had once strutted around like a queen had been replaced by someone frazzled, smaller, almost hollowed out. She wore an oversized jacket. Her normally perfect bob was uneven, and the faint lines of stress and exhaustion traced her face. She hesitated, as if reconsidering why she had come. But then she squared her shoulders and walked toward his driveway. Alex waited, arms crossed, letting her make the first move. She stopped a few feet away, avoiding his gaze. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked its usual haughty edge. I wanted to talk," she said, softer than he had ever heard her. Alex tilted his head. "About what?" Karen shifted on her feet, taking a deep breath before forcing out the words. "I lost everything." She laughed, but it wasn't the smug, condescending laugh he had grown used to. It was hollow, bitter. "My job, my savings, my house," she admitted, staring at the pavement. "After the lawsuit, the fines, the legal fees, there was nothing left. I had to sell my home just to cover my debts. I don't even live in the neighborhood anymore." For a moment, Alex felt nothing but silence between them. She looked up at him then, and for the first time her eyes didn't hold malice, just exhaustion, maybe even regret. "I was wrong," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About you. About a lot of things." Alex let the words hang in the air, studying her. He wasn't sure if it was a real apology or just the last remnants of a broken woman trying to make peace with the wreckage she had caused. She took a deep breath. "There's a house up for rent, a few blocks from here. I was thinking about moving back." Alex exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "There's nothing stopping you," he said. "The HOA is under new leadership. No more abuse of power." Karen gave a humorless smile. "Ironic, isn't it?" Alex held her gaze. "It didn't have to be." She nodded then, as if finally accepting something she had been fighting for too long. Without another word, she turned back to her car. As she opened the door, Alex called out one last time. "Oh, and Karen?" She paused, looking over her shoulder. "You might want to check with the new HOA first," he said, smirking. "I hear they don't take kindly to rule breakers anymore." Karen let out a breath, half a chuckle, half a sigh. Then, without another word, she got into her car and drove away. Alex watched as her taillights faded into the distance. Taking a slow sip of his beer, he leaned back in his chair, the sun warming his face. The fight was over, and this time, he had truly won.